Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining me today to talk about COVID practice sale considerations. I'm going to look to keep this brief. I felt this is an important conversation for us to have during this interesting time period we're all living through. I know some of us are looking to make transitions during this time, and I wanted to just give you some basic tips on what I see in the marketplace and how you can best prepare yourself for this conversation if you're looking to transition your practice or if you were in that process prior to the current pandemic that we find ourselves in. So just a bit about me before we begin. If you don't know me and you're just finding this on the vast expanse of the internet, my name is Jennifer Kirschenbaum. I'm the managing partner of our Kirschenbaum & Kirschenbaum Healthcare Department, and I devote my practice towards representing practitioners in their day-to-day operations, their sales and acquisitions, employment constructs, corporate matters, and miscellaneous related to their general operation, problems with third-party payers or patients and employees. And I work with a number of private equity firms in their day-to-day operations in healthcare. So our agenda today is going to be pretty brief. I'm going to try to keep it to only a couple of minutes. And if you have any additional questions, you can always reach me. Email is usually best. I want to just talk about what's going on right now, which is a finite period of time, but a concern that can be a bit of an issue, the Payroll Protection Program. Most of us have taken that money and we have not yet been forgiven, and the timing of that, of the forgiveness period can impact our ability to transition our assets and ownership of our practice, and I want to make sure we're mindful of that during this period of time. I want to discuss value considerations and fighting the unknown, drafting for protection. So again, I'm going to try to keep it brief. We'll go over some basics. With the Payroll Protection Program considerations, the money that we've taken to bring back our staff, the forgiveness of it is contingent on a number of things, one of which is abiding by the terms of the promissory note that you likely signed. Now, the majority of the notes that I've seen have a number of representations and warranties that are embedded into the note that you signed to take the money for the Payroll Protection Program. You probably did not read it with a fine-tooth comb. However, in that note, which I do ask that you read now or have your counsel read, or if I'm your attorney, send it over and make sure that I checked it. And I will probably tell you that there are prohibitions on you transferring your practice during this time period. Now, what happens if you were to violate the representations that you've made in that note? You may be jeopardizing the forgiveness prospects for the loan that you've taken, and you could possibly end up converting your note from a forgivable note into a debt that you owe back with interest. Now, many of us do not want to risk that. So since that's the case, we want to be mindful of the scenario we've put ourselves in. So you're going to confirm restrictions on sale of your practice or transfer of assets during this time period. The best way to do that is to comprehensively review and understand what we've signed, and also speak directly with our bankers and make sure that we understand what we are limited in doing during this time period. We also want to understand what promises have we made about the employable nature of our staff, and what commitments we've made to our bank to maintain them during this time period. If we're going to be assessed on a calendar year basis until December 31st of this year, we need to understand that, because it could very much impact when you would close on a sale. So these are conversations we need to have now as we start to think about time frame on possible transition. And I would really significantly advise against getting too excited about a transition timeline until we understand when forgiveness will be available by your bank. If you have banked upon the concept of not having the money taken convert into a loan, even though that number would be a very low interest loan, we want to maximize forgiveness to the extent that you are counting on that. So we need to understand the timeline of a potential practice transition. As we move into practice transition, there has been a lot of concern around the question of consideration. Now, potential buyers are out there. There is a lot of dry powder out there, money available for distribution because of what's happened in the marketplace, and the market has been very dry for the past several months. So people do want to spend, and there are definitely buyers out there looking for practices. The question is, when can you transition and on what terms? Now, whether or not you see a discount in the value of your practice is going to depend on a number of different considerations. One is, how did you fare to date with COVID? Are you open? Are your patients currently seeing you or other providers in your practice? Have you suffered attrition on the staff level, on the patient level? Have you been able to bring back your employees? Have your patients returned? For what? For what services? Is it for just a backlog of services that they're coming in for, and then they're not going to continue to come in for regular visits, emergency only? Or are you seeing regular volume similar to what you would have been seeing had we not have the pandemic in place? And a lot of that is specialty specific, and you'll see knowledgeable buyers understanding of that and potentially adding back certain credits during this time period with the knowledge base that in all likelihood the pandemic is a limited situation. They're going to also look, well, we talked about mainly volume, but how has everything impacted your revenue, and how have you been managing expenses during this time period, which is a little bit less of an impact on them, because if you're selling to an educated buyer, an individual who owns maybe a few sites, whether that's a doctor-based or someone who has some additional help and support on the back end administrative, then they'll know how to decrease the costs of operations once they come in. So you can worry a little bit less about that. If you're looking to mostly transition to a colleague who is just going to take over the records for you and solve for that tricky and cumbersome HIPAA obligation to maintain the patient records after you transition out of patient care, that's a little bit harder of a scenario to support a potential number that you would have seen prior to the pandemic. So it really depends who you're looking at to make the transition to. And I chose this graphic to tell your story because your story can be any number of variations and versions. And prior to you entering into a discussion with a buyer, we need to nail down your narrative in the most positive light possible so that we can explain to a potential buyer the value of your practice and how that value has not diminished, and you do not believe it has diminished during this time period. Because that argument is being made successfully by sellers. And I've seen plenty, even in this short period of time of sales picking up, where we've been able to maintain the integrity of the sales structure, and the seller has been able to see what would have been adequate value prior to the pandemic setting in, which is interesting because I would have actually thought we'd be seeing more of a significant discount. And in fact, I think a lot of educated buyers are looking at the pandemic as a total anomaly. Now, that is not the case if the selling doctor has decided that he is going to become a departing seller, an individual who no longer wishes to provide patient care and is possibly looking to work a little bit of magic and to maybe realize revenue by being an attrition magician. And I consider this to be someone who wants to phase out very quickly and try to retain value for a seller, but not be an active part of the practice. The converse side of this is a seller who, for whatever reason, maybe was thinking of transitioning soon, and now maybe this is expedited, or they see that there is opportunity in the marketplace and there's buyers interested at this time. for the reasons mentioned, that there's money available to be spent at the moment, or some buyers are looking to possibly try to get an edge, and so they've loosened up the coffers a bit now. And so the converse of the departing seller is going to be the seller who's willing to stay and to service his patients or her patients, and therefore cutting down the rate of potential attrition. Patients know you, they love you, you are the goodwill of the practice, and if you have a buyer who's looking to come in and maintain the integrity of your patient population and continue what you have built over the years, then the best way to do that is to retain the seller. Now, to fight the unknown in this time period, and again, this is just a brief conversation I thought would be easier to do vocally, orally, as opposed to just in a number of written newsletters. We want to be drafting for protection here. So an earn-out construct where you are to be paid based on retention, patient retention, services rendered, that construct in New York is questionable. Under the corporate practice laws in this state, we are not authorized to structure, professionals not authorized to accept a deal where the purchase price is contingent upon performance. So how are buyers getting around this? Well, some are ignoring the regulations and they are structuring a basic earn-out. Are you willing to take that risk? Possibly. There have not been that many deals that have been busted up for not being structured properly. However, you should know that there are laws in place that will make it questionable whether or not earn-outs are appropriate. Now, what is an appropriate earn-out? An appropriate earn-out is one where possibly you are paid more under your employment for services personally rendered by you and productivity by you personally post-closing. So in other words, there would be incentive payments for your volume as an employed doctor post-closing, not related necessarily to the sale, but to your personal production. Now, a lot of doctors will take pause at that statement because they may realize, or they may eventually realize that, well, there's a tax differential. If I receive money under a purchase agreement, I'm going to be able to take that money, depending on the allocation that's set forth on the assets, as capital gain, versus if I were to take that money by ordinary income under my employment contract. And there may be a differential there. However, it's really a question on what your risk appetite is, because in the state of New York and several other states, we do have a prohibition on putting earnouts into a purchase agreement related to an asset transfer. So you may find an educated buyer that will say, look, for compliance reasons, it's no difference to us, it's the same money, but for compliance reasons, we've elected to not put it into the purchase agreement. And as an attorney, it would be very difficult for me to take a position except to respect the adherence to the current rule of law in this state. So from my perspective, the earn-out construct you would see in an employment agreement, and it may result in a tax differential that is not necessarily favorable to the seller. So you may want to be aware of that as you look to structure potential deal constructs. Now, another way to get around protection for the unknown, unknown would be, what if we have to curtail services again in the near future for a period of time? Well, if a buyer is stepping in and incurring the cost of operating or shutting down during that period of time and not you, they may want to, one, decrease the purchase price, or two, hold money in abeyance and possibly recoup on some of the funds. So there may be an step that is built into the deal. You may also see between or signing, and so instead of not buying, it would be signing and then closing. You may cut a deal or agree to a deal, on transition periods, we want to understand what the terms are going to be between signing and closing, because when you get into an engagement, if the marriage is going to be called off, we want the terms for the marriage being called off to be defined. So here, if we have a willing seller, but we have a buyer who is not willing to close for whatever reason, because of another shutdown, decrease in revenue, decrease in employees willing to work, we want all of those terms laid out. So, or we want provisions built in to protect against that scenario. Once we as a seller have committed to a practice transition, we want to make sure the deal is pretty final. So when we're negotiating terms of a transition period, you can't wait until the last minute where you have a purchase price agreed, you have documents mostly done, but then, oh, wait a minute, the buyer's going to come in and say, look, we just want to make sure that we understand what we're buying. Well, they know what they're buying now. And if there's another shutdown, we want to make sure that they're a partner with us and that the deal is going to go through. So we want to be mindful of that as we enter into negotiations so we can finalize appropriately. So there's a lot of thought process that has to go into picking the right buyer on the right terms. And it's not always about the number up front unless you're simply looking to depart. In which case, if it's the number up front and you're looking to transition out and retire or move on to another area, perhaps you're moving, then we want to make sure we get the number and that the number is not recoupable in an easy manner, that there's no real threat of indemnification, you're being very upfront on what you're selling, and that you can walk away without a headache. So the way we properly prepare for this is we understand your priorities going in, and then we identify the areas that have to be really targeted in discussion prior to entering into any real negotiation and certainly any contract. So we can do a lot of this work up front, and that starts with our initial conversation. So this is really what I wanted to talk about, because I think that unlike any other time that we've been in, the prep work is going to be really, really critical, especially related to the PPP forgiveness. You really can't think about selling until we have an understanding on what that process is going to look like and how you're going to be hamstrung by your personal bank's timeline for this transition process and getting the forgiveness done. There's no reason to risk having to repay that loan, which you're going to be on the hook for, just because you're selling. So, and again, this is going to be very temporary, likely through early September, possibly October, where some of us are going to have monies outstanding. And then we still have to understand what the obligation is to the employees during this time period to make sure there's no exposure. So if you are thinking about making a transition, I am available. You can feel free to email me or give me a call, and we can talk about your personal circumstances. I do know that many doctors have considered not returning and to retire, in which case you may not be as concerned about the number that's being offered, but really the transition of your patient care and records. And if that is your main concern, at a minimum, we need to focus on liability protection and transitioning of that HIPAA obligation. So that way you're not out of the state a year or two from now and still receiving patient phone calls looking for records. And we can handle that by agreement and making a proper transition to a colleague and effectuating a proper record transfer. So I want to thank everyone for their time. I tried to keep it brief today. If you have any questions, feel free to give me a call. If you're looking for more information on this topic or any other related to practice area, you can certainly visit our website here at kirschenbaumesq.com. Thank you, everyone, and wishing you a nice night.